This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to a journey into a rarely discussed chapter of Japanese history. We often associate Japan with samurai and cherry blossoms, but beneath the surface lies a complex and often overlooked story of coerced labor and human trafficking. From ancient forms of servitude and the global slave trade to the Edo period's hidden chains, this narration will uncover the enduring realities of unfree individuals in Japan, challenging common perceptions and revealing a nuanced past. Chapter 1. Indigenous Chains, Japan's Ancient and Medieval Servitude. The earliest Japanese records hint at the presence of unfree individuals in antiquity. The 3rd century Chinese historical record, Wajinden, for instance, makes a fleeting mention of the export of a slave from Japan, referring to these individuals as seiko, or living mouths. While the precise nature of this system in such early times remains somewhat shrouded in the mists of history, it signals the existence of a practice that predates the more formalized systems. By the 8th century, with the establishment of the Ritsuryose legal codes during the Nara and Heian periods, the institution of slavery became more clearly defined. Here we encounter the nuhi, a term encompassing both male slaves, nu, and female slaves, hi. These individuals were an integral, though often overlooked, part of society, legally considered property that could be bought, sold, and inherited, tasked with tending farms and performing various household duties. While exact figures are difficult to ascertain, historical estimates suggest that the nuhi population could have constituted around 5% of the total populace. This wasn't a marginal phenomenon. It was a visible and legally recognized class of people whose lives were fundamentally shaped by their unfree status. The very existence of such a system, enshrined in law, underscores a societal structure where personal liberty was far from a universal right. As Japan transitioned into the medieval period, particularly during the turbulent Sengoku era, often romanticized as the Warring States period, these forms of coerced labor not only persisted but also intensified and diversified. This was a time of relentless conflict, shifting alliances, and profound social upheaval, where the value of human life could be tragically diminished. Slavery, in various forms, persisted into the Sengoku period, even though the attitude that it was anachronistic seems to have become widespread among elites, creating a tension between evolving perceptions and enduring realities. One of the most pervasive indigenous forms of bondage during this era was the genin system. The term genin literally translates to lower person or subordinate person, a stark reflection of their position within the social hierarchy. Unlike some chattel slavery systems that viewed individuals purely as property, genin were often understood as persons whose labor and movement were permanently tied to a specific household, a powerful family, or a parcel of land. While they possessed some rights, such as owning property, buying their own freedom, and having relations with people outside their household, they critically lacked the right to choose where to live, and could usually be put to death by their owner. This nuanced status highlights the complex nature of medieval Japanese bondage. The genin status was, for many, an inherited condition. Children born to genin parents would typically inherit their parents' unfree status, perpetuating a cycle of hereditary service across generations. Their roles were essential, underpinning the economic and domestic lives of the ruling classes, landowners, and even religious institutions. Many genin toiled as agricultural laborers, cultivating fields and supporting the agrarian backbone of the great estates. Others served within noble or samurai households, performing a myriad of domestic tasks, from cleaning and cooking to guarding and assisting with daily affairs. While their personal freedoms were severely restricted, their masters often provided a degree of livelihood, creating a complex and often deeply embedded interdependent relationship. This wasn't just about economic necessity. It was a deeply ingrained social construct, a part of the accepted order. Beyond hereditary status, various circumstances could lead an individual into the unforgiving embrace of genin status or other forms of servitude. Economic hardship, particularly during times of famine or natural disaster, was a brutal pathway into bondage. Faced with starvation, individuals or even entire families might make the agonizing choice to sell themselves or their children into servitude in exchange for food, clothing, and shelter. This desperate act, often driven by survival, blurred the lines between free and unfree. Peasants, too, could be sold as tax collateral, further blurring the distinctions between free and unfree, and transforming human beings into commodities traded for basic necessities. One can only imagine the desperate calculus a parent might perform when faced with the choice between their child's freedom and their very survival. Warfare, the defining characteristic of the Sengoku period, was another major engine of human trafficking. Japanese daimyos, or feudal lords, and opportunistic merchants frequently sold off prisoners of battle into slavery. Accounts from both Portuguese and Japanese sources, like the Koyo Gunkan and Hojo Godaiki, describe the greatest cruelties inflicted during conflicts such as the Battle of Kawanakajima in 1553 or the Shimazu campaigns of 1578. Entire communities were devastated, and captives, particularly women, boys, and girls, faced horrific violence before being sold. This wasn't merely a localized practice. The inter-Asian slave trade, including the activities of Woko pirates, further intensified this suffering, with reports noting Chinese slaves in Satsuma being treated like cattle for labor, a fate many Japanese also shared. Zheng Shungong's 1556 report, for instance, specifically noted 200 to 300 Chinese slaves in Satsuma. This internal market for war captives provided a constant, brutal supply for existing systems of unfree labor. Criminality, too, could lead to a loss of freedom. Japanese rulers imposed geninka as a punishment for serious crimes or acts of rebellion. The Awakata clan documents provide a powerful, chilling example. Because I, Mako Saburo, committed a crime, I was supposed to have been put to death. However, because I apologized, I was spared and have drafted a hikibun, handing over my personage in accordance with the law. If I escape, 3 of my family members may also be taken as hereditary servants. This vividly illustrates the severity and hereditary nature of criminal servitude, often extending beyond the perpetrator to include their wife and children, binding entire families to servitude. Even women seeking refuge from abusive fathers or husbands could find their fate sealed by a lord, who might transform them into genin rather than offering true protection. This practice highlights the stark power imbalances and the limited avenues for recourse available to the most vulnerable members of society. The prevalence of internal human trafficking was widespread and deeply ingrained in the social fabric. It was, quite simply, abundant. Bandits roamed the roads, preying on travelers, robbing them, and kidnapping them to be sold into servitude. Even in major cities, the danger was ever present. A startling account from 1579 tells of a woman in Kyoto who confessed to deceiving, abducting, and selling more than 80 people. This chilling anecdote reveals the organized and systematic nature of some of this internal trafficking. Beyond criminal enterprises, Japanese lords often demanded that their retainers relinquish their daughters to serve in their manors, effectively treating them as genin. These were not isolated incidents, but rather commonplace occurrences, part of the brutal reality of life for many across the archipelago. It's crucial to understand that while these practices bore striking resemblances to what Europeans would later define as slavery, the Japanese cultural context sometimes offered nuanced distinctions. For instance, the system of Nenki-hoko, or temporary servitude, involved individuals entering into contracts to work for a set number of years, often in exchange for an initial payment or to settle a debt. While Europeans often conflated this with outright slavery, within Japan it held a distinct status, implying an eventual return to full freedom, even if that promise was often broken or extended under duress. This landscape of indigenous unfree labor and widespread human trafficking, driven by internal conflicts, economic desperation, and established legal and social norms, forms the essential backdrop to understanding Japan's history. It was a complex, often brutal system, deeply woven into the nation's past long before any ships from distant lands appeared on the horizon. This vibrant internal market for human beings, sustained by war, poverty, and power, had already cast a long shadow across Japan, setting the stage for an unforeseen and dramatic expansion of this tragic trade with the arrival of European powers. Chapter 2: Black Ships, Global Chains. When strange towering ships, known to the Japanese as kurofune, or black ships, first appeared off their shores in the mid-16th century, they heralded a new era of trade and cultural exchange. These massive vessels, sometimes called silver carracks or trade carracks, could boast cargo capacities of up to 1,200 to 1,600 tons, with some even reaching 2,000 tons. But with the Portuguese merchants came an unexpected and deeply troubling dimension to Japan's existing landscape of coerced labor, as explored in Chapter 1, the shocking export of its own people into a burgeoning global slave trade. This wasn't merely an extension of existing practices. It was a transformation, turning a domestic tragedy into an international human diaspora. The Portuguese, accustomed to their own burgeoning global slave networks, quickly recognized the existing internal market for unfree labor as a lucrative opportunity. Initially, however, the Portuguese slave trade in the region focused on Chinese individuals. Jesuit Luis de Almeida observed in 1562 that Chinese female slaves, captured by Japanese in coastal villages, were being sold to Portuguese merchants in Satsuma. This Chinese stage of the trade soon gave way to a predominant focus on Japanese individuals, who were purchased, initially in smaller numbers, but soon on a scale that would profoundly impact communities across the archipelago. These Japanese were then sold to various locations overseas, predominantly in Portuguese-colonized regions of Asia like Goa and Macau, but also reaching distant lands such as Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and even Portugal itself. This marked a stark and unprecedented moment. For the first time, Japanese people were being systematically trafficked across continents, becoming part of a global commodity chain. The destinations for these Japanese slaves painted a map of Portuguese colonial reach. Macau, a pivotal Portuguese trading post in China, became a central hub where Japanese slaves were bought, sold, and redistributed. From there, they could end up in Goa, the capital of Portuguese India, or further west to Lisbon, where some Japanese women were acquired specifically for sexual purposes, a fact noted by the Church as early as 1555. Others were transported across the Pacific, becoming part of the Indios Chinos population in New Spain, primarily Mexico, though their numbers there were significantly smaller than African or Filipino slaves. The journey itself was fraught with peril, often involving cramped, unsanitary conditions on these Portuguese now ships, which, while primarily designed for lucrative cargo like silk, spices, and silver, were increasingly repurposed to carry human chattel, transforming into floating prisons for the enslaved. What made Japanese slaves particularly sought after by the Portuguese? Historical accounts reveal a disturbing preference. The Portuguese highly regarded Asian slaves, including Japanese and Chinese, often valuing them more than those from sub-Saharan Africa. They attributed qualities like intelligence, industriousness, and loyalty to them, making them desirable as household servants, skilled artisans, or even as status symbols. This selective valuation meant that Japanese individuals, once enslaved, often found themselves in domestic roles or specialized labor rather than the brutal plantation systems more characteristic of the Atlantic slave trade. This perception, however, did not lessen the cruelty of their bondage. It merely altered its form. For instance, Japanese slave women were sometimes sold as concubines to various crew members, Asian, African, and European, on Portuguese ships, highlighting the sexual exploitation embedded within the trade. In a truly jarring twist of fate, Japanese slaves brought to Macau were not only sold to the Portuguese, but sometimes even ended up as slaves to other slaves. The sources detail instances of Portuguese owning Malay and African slaves, who in turn owned Japanese slaves of their own, creating a complex and multi-layered hierarchy of bondage. The role of the Jesuit missionaries in this unfolding tragedy is complex and often contradictory. Upon their arrival in Japan, figures like Gaspar Vilela and Cosme de Torres observed the existing Japanese systems of servitude. Initially, however, some Jesuits, in their efforts to evangelize and establish a foothold, found themselves deeply intertwined with the Portuguese merchants who were also engaged in the slave trade. They sometimes even issued permits that legalized the status of purchased Japanese slaves, particularly those acquired through existing Japanese customs. This approach influenced their acquiescence to local customs, particularly when it came to temporary servitude. Driven by humanitarian concerns, some Jesuits signed short-term ownership certificates as a pragmatic compromise to prevent lifelong enslavement, a practice later criticized and banned within the order itself. However, many within the Jesuit order harbored deep moral qualms about the trade. As early as 1555, the Church in Portugal expressed concerns that the growing trade in Japanese slaves was negatively affecting Catholic proselytization efforts. This moral unease led to significant pressure for intervention, culminating in a series of international decrees. King Sebastian I of Portugal in 1571 issued a decree banning Japanese human trafficking, part of a broader 1567 law prohibiting slave trade from Ethiopia, Japan, and China. Pope Gregory XIV's 1591 bull specifically ordered reparations for enslaved Indios in the Philippines and threatened excommunication for those involved in the trade, a clear signal of growing international concern. King Philip III of Spain and Portugal followed in 1595 with a ban specifically prohibiting the transfer of female slaves to Mexico. Later decrees in 1605 even allowed enslaved Japanese in Goa and Cochin to seek freedom, further demonstrating the evolving, albeit slow, international legal landscape. Despite these papal and royal decrees, enforcement proved to be a formidable challenge. Local Portuguese elites and merchants, driven by immense profits, fiercely resisted these bans, often rendering them ineffective. The Jesuits in Japan, despite their moral objections, often lacked the secular authority to directly intervene in slave transactions, which fell under the jurisdiction of secular courts. Their efforts were often limited to providing ethical guidance or trying to mitigate the harshest aspects of exploitation. This changed significantly with the arrival of Bishop Pedro Martins in 1596, the first high-ranking cleric in Japan, appointed 1592. He gained the authority to excommunicate Portuguese merchants involved in the trade, marking a crucial shift in the Jesuits' ability to act more decisively against the practice. The sheer volume and profitability of this trade were shocking. The will of Domingos Monteiro, a major Portuguese merchant who died in 1592, explicitly shows the Japanese slave trade as a primary source of his income, detailing his emancipation of many Japanese girls and other slaves. This provides concrete evidence of the trade's scale and its central role in the wealth accumulation of these merchants. This dramatic increase in scale, fueled by the Portuguese, transformed what had been primarily a regional internal trade into a transnational and intercontinental network. The existing Japanese practices of selling people were now plugged into a vast global system, exposing Japanese individuals to a fate that stretched far beyond their island nation. This influx of foreign demand and the resulting export of Japanese people into a global slave network would soon catch the attention of Japan's most powerful unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation over the sovereignty and dignity of his nation's people. Chapter 3. The Unifier's Contradiction. Imagine the Japan of the late 16th century, a nation reeling from over a century of civil war, now on the cusp of unification under the formidable leadership of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. This was a man of humble origins who rose to absolute power, driven by a vision of a unified, stable, and prosperous Japan. It is against this backdrop of immense political ambition and national transformation that we encounter one of the most intriguing and debated moments in Japan's history of coerced labor. Hideyoshi's dramatic ban on slavery in 1587, reaffirmed in 1590. Was this a genuine, morally driven abolition, a true turning point in human rights? Or was it a far more calculated and strategic move, simply redefining the terms of forced labor to serve his own political and economic ends? The stage was set by the shocking proliferation of the Portuguese slave trade, which we explored in our last chapter. Japanese people were being trafficked across vast oceans, ending up in far-flung corners of the Portuguese Empire. This deeply disturbed Hideyoshi. In his 1587 edict, famously known as the Batarin Edict, he expressed profound outrage, declaring, "This is unbearable to me. Their hands and feet are chained, and they are driven into the bottom of the ships. This is far beyond the punishment in hell." This was not just a minor grievance, it was an affront to his nascent national sovereignty and a direct challenge to his authority as the unifier of Japan. He demanded that all Japanese who had been sold to India and other remote places be returned, and that those currently held by the Portuguese in Japan be freed, even offering to pay silver for their release. Hideyoshi's concern was also keenly economic. The depletion of Kyushu's labor force, exacerbated by the foreign trade, threatened his vision of a prosperous Japan. This decree was a powerful assertion. It positioned Hideyoshi as a protector of his people, drawing a clear line against foreign exploitation. His edict also ordered the expulsion of Christian missionaries, whom he explicitly blamed for facilitating the trade. A memorandum preceding the official edict even alleged that missionaries were actively involved in trafficking Japanese individuals to China, Korea, and various European territories. To Hideyoshi, the burgeoning foreign presence, particularly the Christian element, was intrinsically linked to the humiliation of his people being sold abroad. He saw Christianity as a disruptive force, undermining traditional Japanese values and loyalties, and the slave trade served as stark evidence of its perceived negative influence. However, a closer look at Hideyoshi's actions and the precise wording of his edict reveals a more complex picture. While he condemned the foreign slave trade, the final version of the Batarin Edict conspicuously omitted the direct accusations against missionaries regarding trafficking. Instead, it sharply distinguished between religious activities and commerce, stating, "The purpose of the black ships is trade, and that is a different matter." It even permitted unrestricted entry and return for merchants from Kirishitan country who did not disturb the law of the Buddhas. This selective condemnation protected Portuguese merchants, who were in reality the principal actors in the slave trade, from any direct sanctions. The blame was almost exclusively laid at the feet of the Jesuits, allowing the lucrative trade itself to continue, albeit under new, stricter rhetorical guidelines. This immediately casts doubt on whether Hideyoshi's ban was a universal moral stance against human bondage or a strategic move to control foreign influence and project national strength. The Jesuits themselves, caught in this geopolitical crossfire, found their position increasingly precarious. As explored in Chapter 2, many within the order harbored genuine moral objections to the slave trade, but their efforts to curb it were often hampered by a lack of secular authority and the immense profitability of the enterprise for Portuguese merchants. Letters from Jesuit Vice-Provincial Gaspar Coelho to the Father General in Rome vividly describe the horrors of the trade. Coelho noted that the Japanese cannot bear to see their people as slaves or being taken to other countries, a sentiment echoed by Hideyoshi. Despite this internal awareness and even reprimands from Rome, the Jesuit involvement in the slave trade proved difficult to eradicate. Their attempts to rationalize their actions, often stating, "because the Japanese sell them," highlighted a cynical justification for their complicity. Even the Jesuit visitor to Japan, Alessandro Valignano, distinguished between sad slavery, like that of African blacks, and the positive enslavement of Japanese, which he termed tolerable slavery, justified by principles like possidentis, possession, and bona fides, good faith. This academic distinction, however, did little to alleviate the suffering of the enslaved. Antonio Lopez, rector of the College of Nagasaki, complained in 1588 that he had been banished from his post for publicly opposing the enslavement of Japanese people. He even accused another Spanish priest, Gregorio de Cespedes, of collaborating with Macau merchants in the trade. Lopez recounted a harrowing incident where a Portuguese merchant attempted to smuggle a young Japanese girl onto a ship to Macau by hiding her in a large box. Her desperate cries were heard by guards, and when the box was opened, the girl was found half dead. When authorities tried to inspect the merchant, Father Cespedes intervened, claiming the box belonged to the fathers and the church to prevent its inspection, and the merchant took refuge in the church. This shocking episode not only exposed the brutal realities of the trade, but also the continued complicity, or at least the perceived complicity, of some within the Jesuit order, despite Hideyoshi's explicit ban and internal admonitions. The sheer scale was staggering. Lopez claimed that in 1588, the Macau ship carried over 1,000 Japanese slaves to China, transforming what was ostensibly a trading vessel into a true slave ship. This persistent trade, even after the 1587 edict, highlights the challenges of enforcing such a ban, especially against powerful economic interests. Father General Claudio Acquaviva harshly reprimanded Jesuits for their involvement, and their position began to shift significantly around the 1598 Nagasaki meeting, leading them to abandon theological principles previously used to support enslavement. However, enforcement remained difficult, not least because the Viceroy of the Portuguese state of India faced Goan resistance to issuing anti-Japanese slavery laws due to the dependence of the Portuguese state of India on a Japanese labor force. Hideyoshi, for his part, was not entirely toothless in his enforcement against internal actors. In the 1590s, his authorities crucified Japanese traffickers by the docks of Nagasaki as a stark warning against facilitating the foreign trade. But the most significant challenge to the idea of Hideyoshi as a true abolitionist comes from his own actions. Just 2 years after issuing his ban, in 1589, Hideyoshi ordered the establishment of the Yanagihira pleasure quarter in Kyoto, formalizing the yukaku system of licensed prostitution. This system, which tacitly legitimized the sexual enslavement of women within Japan's borders. More on this system and its enduring legacy can be found in Chapter 4. Procurers openly offered women as commodities to arriving sailors in Hideyoshi-controlled Nagasaki, demonstrating a profound moral inconsistency. Even more damning was Hideyoshi's own engagement in mass human trafficking during the Japanese invasions of Korea, 1592 to 1598. While he expressed indignation and outrage at the Portuguese selling Japanese people, he himself oversaw the abduction of tens of thousands of Korean prisoners of war, who were then transported to Japan and sold into slavery. Italian merchant Francesco Carletti, who visited Japan during this period, even bought 5 Korean slaves himself, noting their low price. Hideyoshi's criticism of missionaries and European traders for enslaving Japanese people abroad stood in stark contrast to his own actions in Korea, which involved far more violent and large-scale practices. This reveals a profound double standard. Slavery was abhorrent when it affected Japanese people at the hands of foreigners, but acceptable, even legitimate, as a form of war booty or state-sanctioned labor when it served Japanese interests. Historians suggest that Hideyoshi's primary concern was not a universal moral opposition to slavery, but rather preventing Japan's humiliation by foreign powers and asserting control over its populace and economy. He wanted to build a stable society, and the export of Japanese people was seen as draining the country of potential workers. His worldview was deeply ethnocentric, rooted in a belief in Japan's divine status and the perceived barbarity of others. This allowed him to justify Japan's actions, including wartime atrocities, while framing foreign cultural influence or harm to Japan as invasion or degradation. The ban, therefore, was less about a principled stand against human bondage and more about national pride, control, and strategic management of his burgeoning empire. So, was Hideyoshi's ban a true abolition? The evidence suggests it was a strategic redefinition of coerced labor, a complex political maneuver rather than a universal moral awakening. While the ban officially prohibited the export of Japanese people into foreign slavery and nominally aimed to end domestic slave trading, it did not eradicate the underlying systems of dependency and forced labor within Japan. Instead, these practices morphed, continuing to shape the lives of many, revealing the enduring complexity of human exploitation, even in a supposedly slavery-free Japan under Hideyoshi's rule. Chapter 4. Edo's Enduring Chains. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's dramatic bans on slavery in 1587 and 1590, discussed in detail in Chapter 3, marked a pivotal moment. Yet they did not eradicate the deeply ingrained patterns of coerced labor, dependency, and human trafficking that had long characterized Japanese society. Instead, as Japan entered the long and often tranquil Edo period, 1603 to 1868, under the Tokugawa shogunate, these practices mutated, adapting to the new legal landscape. While outright chattel slavery, as understood by Europeans, was officially abolished, other forms of unfree labor persisted, often legally sanctioned or subtly redefined, maintaining a grip on countless lives. The Edo period saw the codification of laws that, paradoxically, both prohibited explicit human trafficking and created new avenues for legally sanctioned forms of unfree labor. The Gotoke Reijo, or Tokugawa house laws, compiled between 1597 and 1711, included provisions for what was termed non-free labor. Most notably, Article 17 prescribed such servitude for the immediate family of executed criminals. This chilling prospect, a family condemned to forced labor, legally bound to serve the state or a lord, underscores the enduring acceptance of coercive labor as a tool of social control and punishment. While historical records suggest this particular practice never became widespread, its very existence within the foundational legal codes speaks volumes about the limits of the era's abolitionist stance. Perhaps the most pervasive and culturally significant form of coerced labor that flourished in the Edo period was nenki hoko, or temporary indentured servitude. Many of these indentured servants, particularly young women, found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, their promised return to freedom perpetually deferred. Nowhere was this phenomenon more tragically evident and more deeply institutionalized than in the yukaku system, the licensed pleasure quarters that became a defining cultural feature of the Edo period. These quarters, such as Yoshiwara in Edo, Shinmachi in Osaka, Shimabara in Kyoto, and, significantly, Nagasaki with its unique connection to foreign trade, were not only centers of entertainment but also complex institutions built upon the debt servitude of women and girls. The stories of these women, often referred to as yujo, women of pleasure, or, at the highest ranks, oiran and tayu, are heartbreaking. Most were sold into these establishments as young girls by their parents or relatives, desperate to alleviate family poverty or repay debts. The initial payment received by their families became an insurmountable debt, often compounded by the cost of their training, clothing, and daily expenses within the quarter. They were, in essence, indentured for life, or at least until their debt was repaid, a feat few could ever achieve. Their contracts, though legally distinct from outright slavery, effectively bound them in slave-like conditions. They were confined within the walled and guarded quarters, their movements severely restricted, allowed out only for rare, carefully supervised events. Their lives were meticulously controlled, their bodies and labor commodified, all under the guise of a legally regulated and culturally accepted system. The Edo government, far from being unaware, actively licensed and regulated these pleasure quarters. This regulation wasn't primarily for the protection of the women, but rather to control public morals, manage urban spaces, and, significantly, to generate tax revenue. The yukikaku system, therefore, became a legally sanctioned institution that relied heavily on human trafficking and debt bondage, effectively creating a state-supported framework for coercive labor, especially for women. This reveals a profound moral inconsistency. While the export of Japanese people into foreign slavery was condemned as a national disgrace, the internal exploitation of women and girls under similar conditions of debt and control was institutionalized and even celebrated as a unique cultural phenomenon. Beyond the formalized structures of Nenki Hoko and the Yukaku, various other forms of human trafficking and coerced labor persisted throughout the Edo period, often operating in the shadows despite official prohibitions. The Tokugawa shogunate, recognizing the continued prevalence of these practices, resumed the persecution of human traffickers in the 1610s. The second shogun, Tokugawa Hidetada, enacted specific prohibitions targeting these illicit activities. These laws, in their very attempt to regulate and suppress, inadvertently provide us with a detailed glimpse into the myriad ways individuals continued to be exploited. Kidnapping by bandits on roads, deception in cities leading to forced servitude, and self-sale during famines. The legislation specifically targeted the trafficking of various categories of dependent laborers, including hokonin, servants, wakato, young retainers, chugen, middle-rank servants, hikan, house servants, and komono, menials, highlighting the diverse forms of bondage recognized and regulated. Even though the official stance was against such practices, the economic realities for many Japanese meant that desperate measures continued to be taken, and opportunistic individuals continued to profit from human misery. As the Edo period drew to a close and Japan faced increasing pressures from the outside world in the mid-19th century, new forms of coerced labor, or older forms re-emerging with greater visibility, began to trouble the nascent modern state. The coolie system, a term often associated with exploitable labor in colonial contexts, started to take root in Japan, particularly among the poor and lower classes. These workers, often driven by debt, found themselves in conditions akin to slavery, working in plantations and other labor-intensive areas, such as the sugar plantations of Hawaii, and sometimes even further overseas. The domestic debt bondage within the sex trade also became more pronounced. This continuity from the Edo period into the Meiji Restoration highlights how deeply embedded these practices were, resistant to easy eradication by mere legal pronouncements. The transition from the Edo period to the Meiji era in 1868, often hailed as a period of rapid modernization and reform, initially grappled with the enduring legacy of these coercive labor systems. The Meiji government, viewing the existence of these forms of slavery as shameful in the eyes of the Western powers it sought to emulate, eventually issued the Geishogi Kaiho Rei, Emancipation Edict for female performers and prostitutes. When the brothels, accustomed to their legally sanctioned system, resisted and demanded financial compensation for their losses, the Meiji government pointed to the Tokugawa slavery bans, like Hideyoshi's, to argue that these brothels had always operated illegally. This was a convenient reinterpretation of history, effectively whitewashing the state's long-standing complicity in the yukaku system for centuries. The edict, however, did not ban prostitution itself, only certain forms of debt bondage, leaving open loopholes that allowed coercive practices to persist. It wasn't until the Penal Code of 1907 that human trafficking was formally forbidden, attempting to finally close the door on these centuries-old forms of exploitation. Yet, as with all legal bans against deeply entrenched social ills, the illegality of human trafficking never truly ceased the behavior, only pushed it further into the shadows. The cultural legacy of this persistence is profound. It demonstrates that the path from official abolition to genuine freedom for all citizens is rarely straightforward. The Edo period, despite its reputation for peaceful isolation, was a time when the lives of many Japanese, particularly women and the impoverished, remained circumscribed by systems of labor that, while not chattel slavery, were undeniably coercive and exploitative. These forms of legally sanctioned forced labor and penal servitude, evolving from ancient customs and adapting to new legal frameworks, illustrate how deeply woven unfree labor remained in the social and economic fabric of Japan. This complex and often uncomfortable truth continues to manifest in contemporary forms of exploitation, with an estimated 144,000 people, or 1.1 per thousand population, living in modern slavery in Japan as recently as 2021. From ancient living mouths to the formalized nuhi and genin, Japan's history is deeply marked by unfree labor. The arrival of Europeans transformed this internal practice into a global tragedy, prompting Hideyoshi's complex ban. Yet, even as chattel slavery was officially abolished, forms like the yukaku's debt bondage persisted, revealing a continuous thread of exploitation. This narrative underscores that the path to true freedom is rarely linear, and the echoes of these historical chains resonate even in contemporary forms of modern slavery. Thank you for listening to this complex chapter of human history.